So welcome everybody. I am so glad that you are here. We are connecting to learn more about the American Rescue Plan Act and how decisions about ARPA funds will be used by Greene County. I'm Victoria Solomon. I'm the Community Development Educator with Extension in Greene County. And today we're going to do an overall overview of ARPA. We'll briefly talk about the process in Greene County, and we will definitely be opening up for question and answer. A couple quick notes about Zoom. This session is being recorded and will be posted online. So you have a choice as far as whether or not you want to have your video going and having that on during the recording. I want to make some quick introductions. I'm so excited. My colleague, Daniel Foth, is here. He's a local government specialist with Extension, and he's the director of the Certified Public Manager Program. And I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Diedrick-Kasdorf. She's the Deputy Director of Government Affairs with the Wisconsin Counties Association, and really going to be sharing more about ARPA. So with Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Victoria. I'm Sarah Diedrick-Kasdorf. I'm actually no longer the Deputy Director of Government Affairs at the Wisconsin Counties Association. We did some reorganization and some changes at the office a few weeks ago. I probably should have told you that, and I have not changed my email signature yet. So I'm now the Director of Outreach and Member Engagement at WCA. I lobbied at WCA for 30 years. And we'll finish out the rest of this legislative session and then move more full-time into my outreach and member engagement role. But I think for now, I'm going to try to share my screen here. And hopefully this all works. All right, are you guys seeing that?
Yep, that's coming through.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Perfect. And before I get started, I want to do a shout out and hello to my friend Bill Omican, who I can no longer see on screen. When I first started working at WCA, Bill was on the St. Croix County Board and chaired our Tax and Finance Steering Committee that I staffed. So I've known Bill for a very, very long time and don't see him very often anymore, but I'm glad he could join us as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Glad to be here.
So yeah, just a little shout out to Bill. Wasn't expecting to see you tonight, so hope all is well. So all right, so I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act, and in particular talk about the state and local fiscal recovery funds. One thing I will say about the ARPA funds and the use of our fiscal recovery funds at the local level is there is a lot of information out there with regard to this. And we have maybe 20 to 30 minutes to go through this today. So in no way, shape, or form will we be able to go through all of the, enumerated projects that the feds have said they can approve. We won't be able to identify all of the impacted or substantially impacted groups that the feds have identified as well. So we'll do our best to just talk about the general categories today. And then for those of you that continue to do work with Greene County in this area, I highly suggest going to the Treasury website where they have a 44-page summary of the final rule that came out just a couple of weeks ago, where you can find all of the detail with regard to approved enumerated projects and other things regarding use of the ARPA funds. So just as a quick overview on ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, it was signed on March 11th of last year. It's a $1.9 trillion package that's really intended to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, including all of the public health and associated economic impacts associated with the pandemic. The package is designed to provide aid to states and the local governments, to assist in our public health efforts by funding public health staff and vaccines. It's also designed to provide assistance for our vulnerable populations, to assist our education community, to provide folks with housing stabilization, economic recovery assistance, and direct assistance to families and individuals who may have been impacted by the pandemic. So as you can see, this $1.9 trillion package is designed to do a whole lot of things. In terms of direct assistance for state and local governments, there's really three parts of ARPA. There's the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, and then the Local Assistance and Tribal Consistency Fund. The portion of this that we're really going to focus on today, though, is really the State Fiscal Recovery Fund as well as the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And that amounts to about $350 million total that will be available and is available now to states and to local units of government. Out of the $350 billion allocated nationwide, $195 million of that is allocated for states. $65.1 billion is allocated to counties across the state. And then there's another $65 billion or so that is allocated to metropolitan cities and to smaller units of government as well. The one thing I'll say about the ARPA funds that is very different from the CARES Act funding that we received previously is ARPA allows funding to go directly to counties. So the feds are making direct payments to the county governments, regardless of the size of the county government all across the country. Under the CARES Act, all of the money went directly to the state, and then the states got to make the decisions with regard to how those dollars were allocated, how much money may be shared with local units of government. So that's a huge difference between the CARES Act funding and the ARPA funding. So really the counties are in control of how it is that they choose to spend the money, based, with the only exceptions being anything that the feds say you cannot do with these particular dollars. So in terms of the timeline that we have in which to spend the funding, the feds talk about, and they put the term period of performance in the final regulations that came out on the 6th of January. And really what that means is that you can use your state and local fiscal recovery funds to cover any cost from March 3rd of 2021 through December 31 of 2024. Now, that being said, your funds must be incurred and obligated by December 31 of 2024, but you really have until December 31 of 2026 to complete all of your projects. And by obligated, what they mean here is that orders need to be placed for property or services, contracts and subawards made, and similar transactions completed. So you have until the end of 2024 to make all the decisions about how it is you're going to spend your money, and then you have until 2026 to complete that work. Now, the fiscal recovery funds are paid out to counties in what the federal government calls two tranches. 50% of a county's total allocation was to be made within 60 days of enactment. So that would have taken us to about May or June of 2021. And at that point, most of the counties in Wisconsin, as soon as they could, made that initial request to the federal government and asked for the money to be transferred into their accounts. And then we can access the remaining 50% of the funds at least 12 months after that first payment was made. So if you received your first payment, say June 1 of 2021, you're eligible to receive your second payment on June 1 of 2022. So the federal government, when adopting the ARPA legislation and creating the state and local fiscal recovery program, really identified 4 funding objectives. They talk specifically about supporting urgent COVID-19 response efforts to continue to decrease the spread of the virus and to bring the pandemic under control, to replace lost public sector revenue to strengthen support for vital public services and help retain jobs, to support immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses, and then to address systemic public health and economic challenges that have contributed to the unequal impact of the pandemic. So in terms of Greene County's allocation, the last time I looked it up and the last time I printed the allocation amounts, Greene County was set to receive just under $7.2 million. And that figure I want you to keep in mind, because later on when we talk about uses of the funds, because you guys are under $10 million, you guys will have some additional flexibilities if you choose with regard to how you can use your total allocation if you wish. So eligible uses. The federal government, when they put out its latest, its final regulations with regard to the use of the ARPA funds, really talked about the use of funds in 4 broad categories and in 4 different ways. But they also kind of categorize them by what is the broadest use of the funds and what is the most narrow or most specific use of the funds. And so in order of broadest and most flexible use of the funds to the most specific use of the funds, we can use our ARPA funds to replace lost public sector revenue, to support the COVID-19 public health and economic response, to provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work, and then to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And I'm going to go through some of these 4 uses in a little more detail. Again, not as much detail as I would like if we had 3 hours to do this presentation, but at least we'll go through a little bit and give you an idea as to what it is these dollars can be used for. So the broadest use of the funds, and what the feds identify as the broadest use of the funds, is you can use these dollars to replace public sector revenue loss. And when using the dollars to pay, because you've identified a public sector revenue loss, you can use the funds to pay for government services in an amount equal to the revenue loss experienced due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. But there is an exception to this that we'll get to on the next slide. But when using funds to cover public sector revenue loss, recipients really have a broad latitude to use these fiscal recovery funds for the provision of government services. And government services is very broadly discussed in all of the Treasury documents. And when they talk about government services, they basically mean any service that is traditionally provided by a government. So you think about all of the services that are provided by Greene County government, or the cities, towns, and villages within Greene County. These are all the types of things that you can use these funds on. And again, if you use the funds under this particular category, it means you are subject to streamlined reporting and streamlined compliance requirements at the federal level. So there are 2 different ways in which one can determine federal or revenue loss according to the federal government. This first one is new with the regulations that came out on January 6th, and that calls for the use of a standard allowance. So you have the option when determining revenue loss to say, we're going to take the standard allowance, which allows us to take $10 million of our fiscal recovery funds and spend them on government services during the period of performance. So again, that's why I said that we remember that 7.1, almost $7.2 million that Greene County has available to it, because it means you guys could take the standard allowance and use all of your dollars, if you choose to, on government services, which then gives you the broadest of latitudes in which to spend the money. The other option you guys have is to calculate the actual revenue loss according to a formula that the federal government has created. And that formula has included in it a growth adjustment of around 5.2%. Basically meaning when you run the calculation, if you have revenue growth of less than 5.2%, you can assume revenue loss up to that amount. Now, the tricky thing here is once you make your determination as to which of the 2 options you're going to use, you cannot make a change. So if you say we're taking the standard allowance, you have to continue with that standard allowance throughout this whole period of performance. You can't make a change and say we're running the calculation years 1 and 2, and then year 3 say no, we changed our mind, we want the standard allowance. You cannot do that. So whatever you choose, you are going to be stuck with. Now, in terms of spending on government services, again, we talk about this really broad definition of any service traditionally provided by a government. And there's certain things that Treasury is excluding from the use of ARPA funds, and we'll talk about those later on in the presentation. But really, they talk about this being the most flexible eligible use category under the state and local fiscal recovery fund program. There are some general exceptions that apply as well to the stated exceptions. For example, you're prohibited from using these funds to match medical assistance, for example, because you can't use federal money to match federal money. So that's a general exclusion that applies. That is, that applies to anything outside of the state and local fiscal recovery program. But common examples of things that the feds have identified that one could use these funds for in this particular area include such things as construction of schools and hospital, road building and maintenance, and other infrastructure. You can use the funding for health services, for your general government administration staff and administrative facilities. You can use the funding for environmental remediation. You can use this for the funding of police and fire protection services. You can use it for other public safety services. You can use it to purchase fire trucks, police vehicles, all of those types of things. All of those things fall under the first use in the first category of replacing lost public sector revenue. Now we move on to the second use of the fund. And this is probably the most, I would say it is probably the largest category of allowable expenditures and probably the most difficult to wrap your head around in some respects, because there are within this category multiple different subcategories that the feds have identified. So use 2 really talks about responding to the public health and economic impacts of the COVID-19 public health emergency. So here they talk about, in generally, this category is designed to meet the public health and economic needs of those impacted by the pandemic in local communities, and to address longstanding health and economic disparities, which amplified the impact of the pandemic and disproportionately impacted communities, resulting in more severe pandemic impacts. What that really means is what the federal government and Treasury would like folks to think about when they're spending these monies is, are there certain categories, groups of folks, businesses, what have you, that are typically disadvantaged? And because of some disadvantages that they have, are more negatively impacted by the pandemic than say others of another class. So they want folks to keep those types of things in mind when looking at how to spend some of these funds. And we see this a little more clearly as we get through some of the more defined uses in this second category. So when we again talk about use for the public health and negative economic impacts of the pandemic, this category is really organized around types of assistance that a government could potentially provide to communities or to individuals. They talk about subcategories like public health, assistance to households, assistance to small businesses, assistance to nonprofits, aid to impacted industries, and then also utilizing the funds to grow and increase public sector capacity. So when spending funds in these categories, the federal government under this second use asks you to really think about a couple of questions. They ask you to look at such things as identifying a COVID-19 public health or economic impact on an individual or a class. And then they ask you to design a program that responds to that impact. They provide a little more detail in some of their guidance documents as well. So in terms of step 1, identifying a COVID-19 public health or economic impact, they provide you with some things to think about when going through that analysis. Is there a COVID-19 public health or economic impact? Meaning, can you identify an impact to a specific household, business, or nonprofit, or to a class of households, businesses, or nonprofits? And can you also identify disproportionate impacts or more severe impacts to a specific beneficiary or to a class? And then the final rule that came out from Treasury also presumes that certain populations and classes are impacted and disproportionately impacted. And again, we're not going to have the time today to go through what impacted and disproportionately impacted means, but they identify certain folks, whether they've been unemployed for a certain amount of time due to the pandemic, or whether or not they They live in a census tract, for example, a certain census tract. So these are the types of things that the federal government wants folks to think about when they talk about impacted and disproportionately impacted classes. In terms of designing a response that addresses a response to the impact, the types of responses you should be thinking about can include programs, services, or now capital expenditures. The response should be related and reasonably proportional to the harm. So in other words, if there's significant harm, the response can be significant. You shouldn't have a significant response to something if very little harm was provided due to or caused due to the impacts of the COVID public health emergency. And the final rule here also provides a non-exhaustive list of enumerated eligible uses that respond to pandemic impacts and disproportionate impacts. And I know this is really kind of confusing, but these are the types of things that the federal government wants folks to really think about. So some of these uses in this category are much easier than others. The easiest portion of this is responding to the public health emergency. Under this part of the second use, these are the things I think you guys most people would think of, right? In terms of a public health response. You want to spend your dollars on COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, medical expenses for folks who have been negatively impacted by COVID-19, whether there are expenses that have been unreimbursed for households, for medical providers, or for other folks. There's been a lot of discussion about the behavioral health impacts of COVID-19 and increased use of mental health services or substance abuse services. And so the preventing and responding to violence, that's a new one that I saw most recently, where they determined that there's been in certain communities an increase in gun violence tied back to the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you talk about responding to the public health emergency, how are we responding to these types of impacts, whether they're medical in nature, behavioral health in nature, or even responding to violence. So these are the things you guys would typically think of funding here, right? Like your vaccination programs, your testing programs, your contact tracing, your public communications efforts, in order to educate folks about the pandemic. These are all the types of things that you might utilize in this portion of the second use category. But then there's this other portion called responding to negative economic impacts. And that's really, this is where things get a little more tricky, because the types of services that one can provide really is greatly expanded. So we're talking here in this category, about serving individuals who have suffered economic harm, whether you're a worker, a household, a small business, an impacted industry, or just the public sector. And again, the final rule here presumes that certain populations were impacted and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and it goes on to define those. So a little more specifics here. Responding to negative economic impacts in terms of assistance to households and communities is included in that as well. If you are going to provide assistance in this area, you really need to take a look at the definitions of impacted and disproportionately impacted communities and households. And then the federal government has enumerated projects for each of these things. By way of example, in this category, you can provide such services as some, is housing supports. You can provide, food assistance and food banks. You can use funding for emergency rental assistance, housing assistance. You can provide, funding for, paid sick, medical, and family leave programs. You can use funding here for childcare and early learning services. There's a whole large list of things that one can utilize the fiscal recovery funds for under the category of assistance to households and communities. And then there's the category assistance to small businesses. And again, we're talking about serving small businesses that have experienced negative economic impacts from the pandemic, but you also need to meet the definition of small business. And small business here is really defined by the federal government as having no more than 500 employees, and also meets the definition of small business under the Small Business Act. And then they go on again to identify further from that definition of small business, what is a business that has been impacted or disproportionately impacted. Again, there's lots of definitions associated with all of this stuff that we don't have the time to go through tonight. The same thing too, when we talk about assistance to nonprofits. I think throughout the pandemic, we have seen a number of nonprofit organizations see an increased demand for services. They've had to change some of their operational procedures in order to serve folks. And yet at the same time during the pandemic, we also saw a lot of nonprofits see a decline in their revenue sources. So again, as part of this second use, you can provide certain assistance to impacted nonprofits. Whether you provide them with a loan or grant to mitigate financial hardship, or you can provide them with some sort of technical assistance, just as an example. And then aid to impacted industries. First, you have to define what an impacted industry is. And the federal government has determined that an impacted industry can be defined in two ways. Automatically included in the aid to impacting in the definition of impacted industry is travel, tourism, and hospitality. Those industries were hit hard during the pandemic, continue to be hit hard. And so the federal government has said impacted industry, definitely those three are included. And then in addition to that, there are other ways in which to define impacted industry. So if you're not hospitality or tourism or travel, then you have to show that the industry experienced at least 8% employment loss from pre-pandemic levels, or the industry is experiencing comparable or worse economic impacts as the national tourism, travel, and hospitality industries as of the date of the rule. And so, again, it's not just any industry that you, or any small business or any household you can provide service to. Again, they all have to be negatively impacted somehow by the pandemic. And again, the federal government in the rule, and I'll tell you the final rule that governs the use of these funds is 450 pages of very tiny print. So, again, that's why I referenced the 44-page Treasury summary on all of this, because it's much easier to follow than trying to read 450 pages of tiny print. So these are the types of things, again, under use two. In addition, under use two of the negative impacts of the pandemic, they talk about restoring and bolstering public sector capacity and supporting a government's ability to deliver critical COVID-19 services. So here we talk about such things as allowing governments to cover certain payroll and covered benefits for the time that certain staff have spent responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, they talk specifically about public safety staff, public health staff, and human services staff. To the extent that these staff have spent some time working to mitigate or just in general working on issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic, you can pay for their time and their benefits for doing that type of work. There's also a provision that allows governments to restore their staffing to pre-pandemic employment levels or even above. And there's also an allowable use for governments to support and retain workers. In terms of hiring staff above pre-pandemic levels, there is a limitation on that. I believe that limitation is somewhere around 7.5% above what your pre-pandemic staffing level was. And then the final thing under this, bolstering public sector capacity is you can use funds to provide effective service delivery. And what they mean by that is improving the efficacy of public health and economic programs through such things as doing program evaluation projects, collecting data on projects, doing outreach on projects, and then addressing administrative needs caused or exacerbated by the pandemic. So again, there are some real specific uses here with regard to how public sector employers can boost their staffing levels and certain other needs that they may have with the use of these particular funds. Then they talk about capital expenditures as an additional use under this category. But if you're going to undertake a capital expenditure, the good thing about a capital expenditure is they're typically one-time expenditures, which may be, which may be attractive under this program. But your capital expenditure must respond to the public health and negative impacts of the pandemic. So there are certain rules that apply here with regard to what types of capital expenditures are allowable and which ones are not. If, so for example, some things you can use this funding on for capital expenditures include affordable housing, childcare facilities, schools, and hospitals. But certain capital projects are ineligible based on the federal regulations. And those include such things as building a new correctional facility, the construction of new congregate facilities to decrease COVID spread within the facility. You can't build a convention center, a stadium, or other large capital projects that are intended for the sole purpose of general economic development as part of this capital expenditures provision. If you have a capital expenditure that is going to be greater than $1 million, then you have to provide written justification to the federal government as to why you think the use of these funds meets the specific criteria outlined in the final rule. So you have to explain why the capital expenditure is appropriate. You have to provide a comparison of proposed capital projects against at least 2 alternative capital expenditures and demonstrate why the proposed capital expenditure is the superior one. And so again, my guess is in your county, you're probably not going to have, given the amount of revenue you have, you're probably not going to have a significant number, I'm guessing, of capital expenditure projects over $1 million. So my guess is this is probably, you guys probably aren't going to use this very, if at all. Again, under use 2, they also have a framework in place for eligible uses beyond those that are enumerated. So there are, again, all these enumerated projects that one can use under this category. However, they do recognize that the recipients and the local governments have broad flexibility to identify and respond to other pandemic impacts and serve other populations that experience negative impacts beyond the enumerated uses and beyond who they presume to be impacted populations. So again, Treasury created a framework to allow you to have more flexible use of the funding. But again, they talk about going through the same, that chart I showed you guys earlier. They actually recommend going through a very similar process where you identify a COVID-19 public health or negative economic impact and then design a response that responds to the impact. Again, these first 2 categories are probably the biggest places in which most folks will probably, that we see across the state, probably the biggest place where we'll see a lot of folks spending their funds. But there's a lot of flexibility within these first 2 categories. Category 3, according to the federal government, they deem this one to be category or use 3, premium pay for essential workers performing essential work. So these funds can be used by local governments to provide premium pay to eligible workers performing essential work during the public health emergency. And the premium pay here is really intended to compensate essential workers for heightened risk due to COVID-19. So if you're going to offer premium pay to essential workers, there are limitations on that as well. So you can provide up to an additional $13 per hour per worker, up to a limit of $25,000 per worker. Grants can also be provided to eligible third-party employers that have eligible workers performing essential work, meaning that this isn't just for government employees, but employees such as grocery store workers, nurses, you can certainly use these funds to provide premium pay. But the trick here is making sure that your premium pay is going to essential workers for performing essential work. So we need to know what the definitions of essential workers and essential work is here. So according to the federal government, essential workers are those folks that work. These workers were needed to maintain continuity of operations of essential critical infrastructure sectors. And so they have a whole big list and as part of the Treasury guidance with regard to who an essential worker is. So for example, essential workers are healthcare, emergency response, grocery store workers, restaurant workers, pharmacy workers, behavioral health workers, family and child care workers, social service workers, election workers, laundry workers. These are all that's just a sample of the number of I guess in the list of eligible workers that the federal government has pre-identified. That being said, while the federal government has identified a number of categories of occupations and workers that meet the definition of essential worker, the chief executive of each unit of government has the discretion to add additional sectors to this list as long as you can deem it to be critical to protect the health and well-being of residents. So now that we know what essential workers are, we need to know what is essential work. Essential work, really, there's three components to it. It does not involve work performed while teleworking from a residence. So if you did work while if you worked at home, doesn't count. But instead, what it really is it's the regular physical handling of items that were also handled by others, whether that's patients, whether that's the public, whether that's your coworkers. And then you also have to have regular in-person interactions with patients, the public, or coworkers of the individual that is performing the work. And then, this last slide here, the intent of this last slide is really, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but the intent of this last slide is for folks to ensure to the federal government that if you choose to provide premium pay for essential workers for performing essential work, that you're really prioritizing premium pay to compensate some of the lower income eligible workers. So there are limitations. If you have folks that are making more than 150% of their state or county's average annual wage, it might not apply, for example. So again, the trick here and what the federal government, again, really wants you to think about, and you see this as a theme throughout, is folks that have been disadvantaged historically or have been disadvantaged significantly so as part of the pandemic. And again, they want you to take that into consideration when looking at this premium pay section. The last and final set of uses here, and I'm looking at the time and I'm probably going over a bit, is use of the funds for water and sewer infrastructure. So eligible projects under this particular use include making necessary investments in water and sewer infrastructure. It includes projects that are eligible under the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund. It involves projects eligible under the EPA's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And then there's also additional eligible projects that the federal government has identified, including creating additional stormwater infrastructure, residential wells, lead remediation, certain things like that also would be an eligible project under the water and sewer infrastructure use. And then under the broadband infrastructure use, again, I think this is one that folks have talked about for quite some time, making necessary investments in broadband infrastructure. But in order to do so, you need to meet certain technical standards. They did also provide additional clarification and broaden the uses of infrastructure funds from the interim final rule to the final rule to talk about an expanded set of cybersecurity investments or modernization in your cybersecurity products. So in terms of, I'm not going to go through this, but you can see on the screen, the types of service that they're requiring and requesting that you meet and make an investment in order for it to be an eligible expenditure under this. Again, there are exceptions to all of this as well. But again, I think broadband infrastructure is one place where we're hearing, I think, uniformly across the state, folks really have an interest in investing some funds in that. Now, there's also a list of ineligible uses that I referenced earlier. So states, for example, can't use their revenue to offset a reduction in net tax revenue. You cannot make any extraordinary contributions into pension funds. If you are going to provide premium pay to workers, the corresponding payment into, say, the state retirement fund, for example, would be allowable, but you can't make any extraordinary contributions into pension funds. You cannot use these funds to pay for debt service or to replenish financial reserves, meaning you just can't take the money, put it in the bank for a rainy day, not allowed. You can't use the money to satisfy settlements or judgments. And you also can't utilize the funds for anything that might conflict with anything included in the ARPA statute, as well as you have to make sure that you're not violating any pre-existing federal conditions, again, such as you can't use this federal money to be used as a state share match for Medicaid. Now, there are reporting requirements that are required as well for the use of the funds, depending upon which of the 4 categories you choose to spend your funds in. The reporting requirements can be less or more stringent, I would say. In terms of local government considerations in the use of the funds, one thing we tell our counties to please keep in mind when utilizing this funding is this is one-time funding. So it is, so with one-time funding, you need to be very careful that if you put one-time funding into what could be an ongoing expenditure, that you have identified how it is you're going to continue on with that expenditure once we are out of the period of performance. So it's really important to think about how it is you use this funding and the long-term impacts of that. Related to that, of course, is also the levy limit impact. Again, tied to the one-time funding. If you don't have levy capacity to continue on in an expenditure, you want to think long and hard about such expenditures as hiring new staff or starting new programs. All of these things that you may want to continue on once the ARPA funds go away. Identify how you're going to spend that. Do you have funding within your current levy and within the levy limit to do that? The other thing we want counties to consider is the spending power limitations on counties. And what we mean by that is because counties don't have home rule authority, we really only have the authority to undertake such actions and functions as the state of Wisconsin allows us to in either the Constitution or in the statute. So we need to think long and hard about whether or not we have statutory authority under state law to spend money in certain areas. Now that's a little bit more of a gray area because we have this federal legislation that says this is how you can spend the money. But again, we want folks to really just to stop and think about that, as one consideration in the use of the funds. Now, county processes for allocating the funds. We have counties doing many, many different things. It's my understanding you guys are creating a task force or a committee to make recommendations on how the funds are used. I think that's a great idea, a great suggestion. We've seen a number of counties go in that direction. Other counties don't have quite as formal of a means in which to use the funds. Some counties told us, well, if somebody has an idea, they can just create a resolution. I think it's better to really sit down and come up with a long-term plan about how it is you're going to use the funding. And so the creation of a committee to identify where you may have the most need to use the funds, rather than somebody just saying, this is how I want to use it, I'm going to write a resolution. I think a good thought process here is very helpful. I mean, this is a lot of money for a lot of counties. I don't think we will ever see this type of money coming down to us again as counties, at least not in my lifetime. So I think we need to make sure that we're being good stewards of these funds and making sure that we are using these funds in the best way possible. In terms of how counties are spending the money, again, counties are spending this money in many, many different ways. While we are still very early on in the process, some counties have already made some decisions with regard to the first half of their money. They're spending funding on such things as broadband, on providing legal counsel to assist folks who have been evicted because they've had negative economic impacts and can no longer pay their rent. They're spending money on childcare, utility, water, and sewer. They're upgrading, HVAC within some of their county facilities. They're using the money for mental health services. They're using it to beef up some of their public health infrastructure. Some counties have said that they're using these funds for child welfare purposes, and some counties are using the funds to provide premium pay. So that is what I have for you guys. I apologize if I went a little bit over. That was just a brief overview of what could have been a multi-hour presentation. So I hope I condensed it in a way where you guys could at least have a better understanding of how it is that these funds can be used moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Victoria. I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well.
Sarah, huge thank you. I know that is a lot. So we can break it down more and really in Greene County take the process step by step. So really quickly, before opening it up for questions, a quick overview, super quick overview of Greene County's process. So last year we did a community-wide survey. We asked for people's perspectives on use of ARPA funds. So in Greene County, in response to what values do you hope guide local decision-making around ARPA, the following were ranked the top 5: sustainable, fiscally responsible, equitable, accessible, and efficient. Also, the majority of respondents shared that the decision makers should consider both immediate implications, so less than 3 years, and long-term implications, so more than 3 years, when making decisions about ARPA funds. The Greene County Finance Committee has decided that the best process for deciding the use of ARPA funds is to create an ad hoc committee. The committee will have 9 voting members, the chair of which will be Jerry Guth. Jerry's the chair of the Finance Committee, and there will be 3 non-voting advisory members so that there's representation from Greene County Finance, the Greene County Clerk, and Greene County Development Corporation. As the Greene County Development Educator, I'll be facilitating the process, and applications are currently open. So if you're an adult who lives in Greene County, you are welcome to apply. Applications are available online at the Greene County website, so you can access it there. You just go on the section for the ARPA Ad Hoc Committee under the Government tab, and then you can access the applications. They are due by 8 a.m. on Monday, January 24th to the Greene County Clerk's office. Finance will be reviewing the applications and determining 8 voting members. So from there, we'll be scheduling meetings and determining the appropriate process to consider sort of possibilities, develop recommendations, and that'll go to the Greene County Finance Committee, where it will they'll make a decision and go on to county board. So that's a snapshot of the process. With that, I want to make sure that it's open for a question and answer. So feel free to put in a question in the chat if that's your preferred way of asking a question. Otherwise, feel free to use the raise hand icon and raise your hand. So I'm going to wait a moment. I know that there were a number of questions that people had sort of submitted, and Sarah was fantastic in responding those. Yeah, Bill, if you want to unmute and ask.
Yes, thank you. Sarah, on a lot of grants, there's a non-displacement provision saying that you can't use these new dollars to replace dollars you're already planning to spend. Is there any non-displacement restriction on these dollars?
I have to think about that for a minute, because there's been lots of, I think, Daniel, do you recall, is there non-supplanting language in some of this stuff? I thought I saw somewhere along the way.
Yeah, my recollection is, yeah, you cannot use this money to displace other funds you've already obligated or committed to.
And then as a related follow-up to that, and then I'll stop. But as a related follow-up, if a company has received PPP or things like that, are you required to take that into account or not take that into account? Or you don't have to take that into account, I should say.
Wait, I don't recall reading anything, and Danielle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall reading anything in any of the regulations in either the interim final rule or the final rule about separating out businesses that received PPP funding from those that did not.
Okay, thanks.
And I agree with that.
Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Yeah, Corinne.
So for this committee that is going to be formed, are they then going to make the decisions themselves, or are they going to open it up to like applications, or how is that part going to work?
That's a great question. So it will very much be for the first meeting, right? A discussion of what the process for the committee will be, right? So the committee is really looking at putting together recommendations for finance. And so what process does the committee want to use in order to be able to do that? And so there are a number of different options to do that. To create those processes, the committee could open up for proposals and recommendations very generally. The committee could also sort of dig in further as far as, okay, better understanding. And Sarah, again, huge thank you. This was a lot, right? So really understanding the different options and where Greene County is in those different areas of community. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And from there, opening up to proposals. And there may be committee members with ideas for different ways to go through the process. So that conversation is really going to be identifying the process that the committee will be using to develop the recommendations. A big piece of this is civility, respect, being informed, and being able to have a good process for developing the recommendations for finance. So I just want to check, I believe Jerry and Andrea are on. I want to invite additional responses to that.
Sure. So Victoria gave, this is Andrea Sweeney. Get my picture back up there. Yeah. So yeah, the ad hoc committee is the core of determining everything that Victoria laid out. So what will happen is that information and whatever your recommendations are will go to the finance committee and be presented at that stage, whereupon the finance committee will have to vote whether those are the ways of funding will get spent, because in the end it's still county money. Depending on size of money, we may have to follow some statutes to go to county board for approval as well. But in general, what Victoria said with this is you guys, whoever's in this ad hoc committee, are kind of getting the heavy load. Like you're really going to get into the nitty grits and getting everything prepared kind of how Victoria explained it.
I just want to hop in if I can. So I think there are different ways to look at it. There's heavy load or great opportunity, right?
That's a good way to put it. There you go. Good wording.
Jerry, if you are still on, if there's anything that you want to add, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. As to the question of how the process is going to be, as you said, it's going to be up to the ad hoc committee members. There are some standalone computer programs that we could use to elicit public input, or we could just do it ourselves. It will be up to the 9 people, myself and the 8 others who will constitute the ad hoc committee, decide the process going forward. There are no preconceived processes. Nothing has been established. Hopefully, there are some good ideas out there, and we're looking forward to the public's input. That's it for me.
Yeah, and I would just like to add one more thing, especially if you're very new and are very interested in joining the ad hoc, don't be intimidated by it. We have seasoned county personnel on there. We have great experience with Victoria as well and guidance. So if you have great ideas and you think that you're a benefit to this kind of committee, I would highly encourage you to apply for it, because just because if you're not a county or public sector person at all, it's fine. We are there to give guidance when needed and give input when needed, and get the final results as a positive to the county.
I also just want to add that you are eligible if you are an adult who lives in Greene County. So any other questions? That was a great question. These are great questions coming in. Are there any other questions?
I had a question.
Yeah.
What was the basis of the allocation? Was it population?
So it was kind of a complicated calculation. So it's not just population, but it's also based on tax levy limits as well, along with, impacts. So obviously, because we're under 50,000 in the county, that's why we did get less. If you look kind of across the board, the counties, there's great ARPA websites that you can use. And I'm sure Sarah could probably give you a more exact calculation, but you'll see that a lot of it is determined by population and tax levy limits.
Great question. Any additional questions?
Victoria, just as an overriding question for me, monies can be spent over all four categories, correct? I mean, we can decide to spend money in each of the four broad categories. We're not just bound by one category, correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. I completely understand if you are hearing about this and there are lots of questions that come up in a couple days. That is totally okay. You can reach out and ask questions. Thank you. One just came in. Will the meetings be conducted in person or via Zoom? Great question. And from a facilitation standpoint, I will just put out there that will be a question for the ad hoc committee. So from the facilitation standpoint, I'll be asking the ad hoc committee members about that. And so after the decision is made by the finance committee, that'll be a question that I ask when finance has identified who amongst the applicants will be on the ad hoc committee. So sorry, I don't have a more specific thing. I also, full disclosure right now, I can't tell you the meetings will be at this exact time and in this format yet, because we'll be checking with the ad hoc committee members and we want to make it accessible in that way. But great question, thank you. So huge thank you, Sarah, huge thank you, Daniel, and thank you everybody for joining with those great questions. Feel free to reach out if additional questions come up. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.